God had a covenant with Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were old and had no children. But God made a covenant that through you will have many offspring, and the world will be blessed as a result of your offspring. There's a dramatic telling of this in the book of Genesis, when Abraham is in the desert at night, and he's cut apart animals that was traditionally done when a covenant was recognized. It was known as cutting the covenant. It's a way that two parties would say to one another, if you don't keep up your part of the covenant, then you're dead meat. Fortunately for us, God is more lenient. God kept the promises made in the covenant, even when the descendants of Abraham failed to do so. Throughout time, Abraham's descendants grow, and they make their way to Egypt, where because of their number, they are held under suspicion by Pharaoh, and they are enslaved. God remembers the covenant made with Abraham and frees them from slavery and takes them through the Red Sea and into the wilderness to the Promised Land. There they settle, and the prophets come and anoint the Messiahs, the kings of Israel. And for a time they are very prosperous, and there is a time of security. But eventually the people get lax, and they don't remember their end of the covenant. God's law was given to them in the wilderness as a way of protecting them and setting them apart. But they don't always obey God's laws. They serve other idols. They do not care for the weak and for the vulnerable. And as a result of that, they get themselves into trouble. By the time we get to Isaiah, at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, Israel has already divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel falls first, and then Judah will fall later. Isaiah is there at the beginning of the fall of Judah, warning that they are going to be prey to the empires that are threatening their sovereignty. And then when they are conquered, they are sent into exile, a practice of taking a people and dividing them up so that it's more difficult for them to get together and to form a coalition to try to rebel. But eventually the Assyrian Empire goes the way of all empires. It grows too big, and it can't contain itself, and it begins to be strained in its ability to control the people. And so an enlightened ruler announces that people will now return to the land of their ancestry, to settle in it, to inhabit it, to work its land. And Isaiah is there for that as well. Around chapter 40 and 41 of Isaiah is what one Bible scholar refers to as Isaiah's version of the good news. God is announcing that salvation will come to you. You will return to your home, and you will dwell in it once again. And then in 42, they are reminded, this is happening because you are a covenant people. God is being faithful to the promises made in that covenant. And when you inhabit the land, you are to care for the weak and the vulnerable, for widows, for orphans, for aliens. You are not to utilize them and subjugate them the way the conquerors did, but through you and your acts of charity towards them, they too will become a part of this covenant. Matthew takes this even further. He begins his gospel with a lineage, a genealogy that ends with Joseph, who married Mary and who became the earthly father of Jesus, that goes all the way back to Abraham, the one with whom the covenant was initially established, to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of that covenant, that through the descendants of Abraham, the world would be blessed. And it is through Jesus Christ that you and I enter into the family of God. It is through Jesus Christ that we become descendants of Abraham and Sarah. Through Christ, we become the covenant people. And we are initiated into the family of God through the waters of our baptism. The waters which in our tradition emphasize God's initiation, God who swept over the waters of creation, God who saved Moses' life when he was floating down the Nile as a baby, God who parted the waters of the Red Sea and brought the children into the wilderness, God who provided fresh water in order to maintain them, God who parted the Jordan River as the children entered into the promised land, God who nurtured Jesus in the water of the womb, and God who blessed the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan. It is through our baptism that we become covenant people. And because in our tradition we emphasize that baptism is God's initiation to us, God's reaching out to us and our response, that's one of the reasons we do not rebaptize. Now, for those of you who grew up in other traditions have a different theological understanding of what's going on in baptism. But in our tradition, baptism is a one-time ritualistic action because it represents the covenant with Abraham. That was a one-time action. The birth of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus, Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. One-time events. And your baptism and mine is signified as a one-time event. And just like the Israelites and the people of the Bible, we don't always keep our end of the covenant, but God is always faithful. So we do not rebaptize because God has not messed up. But you and I do occasionally need to repent and to return to the agreement that God made with us, to the promise that God keeps faithful. And there are different times and different ways in our Christian experience that we can remember and celebrate our baptism. We can do this in times of joy and in times of trial. Some Christian families will help their children to appreciate their baptism by celebrating its anniversary. If, like me, you were baptized as an infant, I was baptized in January of 1970. And so about this time of year, a family that would want me to help celebrate my baptism would do so by marking it the way you would a birthday or any other anniversary. Not as elaborate as you would a birthday, but maybe on the Sunday closest to your child's birthday, saying to the child, we are celebrating your baptism today, so we are going out to lunch, and you get to pick where we're going. In a baptismal service, there is usually a sponsor, traditionally known as a godparent, someone who would take interest in the child and be a spiritual mentor for the child. That godparent might get a gift for the child on the anniversary of that child's baptism. When the child is very young, it might be a picture book telling the story of Jesus. As the child gets older, it might be something more sophisticated, like a card that has in it a Bible verse and says to the youth, "This verse of Scripture reminds me of where you are in your life now, and I invite you to meditate and to reflect on this." We remember our baptism during times of trial. Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation, made some very powerful enemies when he challenged the teachings of what were, at his time, the only Christian church in Europe. And there was a danger that he could possibly be arrested and burned at the stake as a heretic. So in order to save his life, one of his patrons, who was an influential nobleman, had him kidnapped and kept him under house arrest in his castle for 2 years for his own safety. And Luther, not being one to grow idle, decided to use this time to translate the New Testament into his native tongue of German, something that has never been done before. And he felt tempted and frustrated during this time and constricted by this, and when he did, he was said to put his hand on his head and say, "Martin Luther, you are baptized." A good friend of mine is a fellow United Methodist pastor here in Virginia, and he and I attended the same United Methodist Junior College, but some years apart. It was a small college back in the days when we went there, so everybody knew everybody else. And he went off to school, and he was a pretty good student, and he had potential, but he was also predisposed to alcoholism. And when he found his freedom in this certain context, it really got out of hand. And one day, the dean of students came to his dorm room in the evening, and he said to him, "You've certainly got potential, and you're a good kid, but if you can't get your drinking under control, I am going to have to expel you. And I will give you until next Monday to decide what you want to do." Feeling troubled, he took a walk that night. And on the outskirts of camp, there is a creek with what was known as Cupid Falls. It had that name because years ago it was kind of a lover's lane escape. But on this particular night, he went there and he was sitting in front of the falls and he was all alone. And he was feeling very distraught. And he confesses to congregations when he shares his testimony that he felt moved to disrobe. And he stood underneath the waterfall. And he closed his eyes and he said, "Something happened to me that has never happened before, and I don't expect it to happen again. But I felt hands gripping my shoulder." In that moment, my friend remembered his baptism. And the Spirit of God that was present in his baptism overcame him. He had a new confidence and a new sense of what he had to do. Over time, he found his way to Alcoholics Anonymous, and through his brothers and sisters there in the 12-step program, they continued what those of you who are familiar with the program know as the very difficult daily work of remaining sober. And over time, the hand of God touched him further, and now he is a very powerful creature. You have been baptized. The Spirit of God was active in your baptism. You may have been an infant, unable to respond for yourself, as I was. You may have been a teenager, still trying to figure out life. You might have been an adult with all of the adult responsibilities on your shoulders, trying to think about who you are as a spiritual being. You may have been in the right frame of mind, or it may have been in a very bad frame of mind. But your baptism is your initiation into the covenant God made with Abraham. It makes you and me one of God's people. And that is why we remember our baptism and we celebrate our baptism. in times of joy and in times of trial. And whether you're aware of it or not, we do it every Sunday. Following the sermon, we recite the Apostles' Creed. And those of you who have been present in our ritual of baptism, you know that what we recite in the Apostles' Creed, in a different version, is what is asked of a candidate who comes for baptism, or in the family of those who bring a child for baptism. That's when we remember who we are as God's people and how we have been transformed by the waters of our baptism.